We ask the questions. What is needed in the world?
Gary Knight je 30 godina kao fotoreporter izvještavao sa svjetskih ratišta i dokumentirao povijest od Kambodže, Bosne, Kosova do Afganistana, Iraka i Ruande. Danas svoj doprinos daje educiranju novih generacija novinara i fotoreportera iz cijelog svijeta kroz agenciju i akademiju 7. Za Al Jazeeru govori o svom iskustvu na terenu, važnosti dokumentiranja povijesti i prevencije zločina, stradavanjima novinara bez presedana i konceptu pravde u nepravednom svijetu.
Mr. Knight, it's a pleasure to have you in our program and welcome to Al Jazeera.
Thank you. Welcome. Very glad to be here. Very happy to talk to you.
And you are back here in Bosnia after a while, but more importantly, after 30 years that you were here, also back during the war. If you could a little bit reflect on that period of time, but also on what you, as somebody who was a person who documented the war and also was part of it in a way, how do you see Bosnia today?
That's a good question. It's when I first came back to Bosnia after the war, I struggled to see a new Bosnia, actually. It was very difficult for me not to keep referring back to the past. But now, and that was maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, now when I come back, it's very difficult for me to remember the past, actually. And I see here an increasingly vibrant country. You know, the young generation here are really have taken a sort of leadership role, a more prominent role. I'm interacting with them, of course, through my work quite frequently. So I would say during the war, it was impossible to see beyond the despair. In the immediate post-conflict period, I felt the same way. But now I'm full of hope when I come here, and it gives me immense pleasure to see Bosnia now, actually. I love coming back here.
Your time spent here was, in a way, a ground for founding your 7 agency and everything that later came from that, with some prominent photojournalists, war reporters as well.
Yes. So I was quite young when I came here. I was in my 20s, and I was part of a generation of a similar age for whom Bosnia was really the biggest story that we had covered. It was where we came of age as humans, and it's where we came of age as journalists. And Bosnia really has a very special place in our hearts because of that. It's where we grew up, actually, I think. And it's where we formed these relationships that have become indestructible. You know, many of us met our partners here, and we made friendships here that have remained incredibly strong ever since. So that's one of the reasons why we built a foundation and the academy here. It's one of the reasons that we were able to build 7, in fact, is because our relationships were so strong. And they were built here during the war, so they were sort of felt indestructible and a very good foundation on which to build, you know, a new enterprise.
You mentioned something while speaking about the time when you were creating this. You are said to be a person who early detected the signs of the demise of the traditional photojournalism and print media and all of the other forms of reporting. How did you detect this? And what, if you could tell us about the journey? We are now in 2024. We are today witnessing a completely new era where we are following wars being live reported by regular humans who are shooting this, who are photographing, documenting. What was the journey, and what can we learn from it, and where is it today?
Good question. So back in the 1990s and early 2000s, I had the privilege of having a very close association with an American news magazine. And so I was able to go on assignment pretty much to anywhere I wanted to go, and had all the support that came with that, which was enormous. But I noticed that except when there was a war going on that America was involved with, Afghanistan or Iraq, you know, assignments started shrinking. The number of photographers who I would see on the road with me was you know, reducing. And it was evident that, you know, the resources that the media had to spend to cover stories were being seriously cut. And so the impact of that, of course, for, you know, media in the UK, France, America that I worked for, was they were no longer adequately covering these stories. And so the public weren't getting the perspectives that they needed. But also, missing from that equation were local voices. And you saw that often here in Bosnia. There are some wonderful examples of Bosnian journalists, Croatian journalists, Serbian journalists who worked here, Kosovar journalists. But for the most part, the media was fed by foreign journalists who didn't speak the language, didn't understand the culture, didn't understand the nuance of what was going on, as well as local journalists. And so since that time, what we have done is train local journalists, whether they're in Myanmar, in the Ukraine, in Palestine, or, you know, elsewhere in the Middle East or South Asia, because the Western media, particularly now, is much, much more reliant on local voices. And those local voices, of course, understand the nuance, they understand, you know, very well, they speak the language, they live these stories, and they can communicate, you know, as well as we can, if we give them the tools and we give them the knowledge and share the knowledge.
And how would you see let's say, fast forward to today, as when we're talking about this as medium of telling stories, yeah. Photography today, photojournalism today, how would you see it? You know, you started as a young man here in Bosnia, and in these wars you covered with a camera in your hands. Today, anybody can have a camera through their phone, and how do you navigate through that? How does your people who work, whose work this is, how do they navigate in this new world?
So when I was photographing here, all my pictures were made on film. I had to put my film in an envelope, write down the captions, and then ship it to New York. And on occasion here, I shipped by horseback out of the town. Garage Day, for example, when that was under siege, I had to ship my film on a horseback, and it eventually made it to New York. So we've now gone from that to an iPhone and instantaneous communication. And so one of the benefits of that, of course, is that you have a multiplicity of voices. You know, you have many, many voices now. Anybody with a phone can record what's going on. Gaza is a perfect example. Palestinians who are equipped just with a phone can record what's happening in their own neighborhood. They can make a film, they can shoot stills, they can record a story. So that's the upside. The downside is that you have a vast amount of information, and as consumers, you know, it requires, you know, we need help sometimes filtering through that and understanding what is credible, what is real, what isn't real. So I think that, you know, one of the upsides is there's more local voices, more information. One of the downsides is it's understanding how to ensure the credibility of the information that we're receiving.
This is when we're talking about photography also, but in general journalism today, there's also, we could say that there is a decline in trust towards, somebody would call it mainstream media, yeah. But also there is this emergence of content creators on different social media platforms that now actually have bigger platforms and are reaching much bigger audiences than multiple decades long media is losing.
We have Palestinian photographers who now have more readers than Newsweek used to have, that, you know, back in the day. So yes, the social media has empowered, you know, a lot of new voices. I think by and large that's a good thing. I think the key is making sure that the public is media literate. I think that's fundamental. And I think that also helps, if you have increased media literacy amongst the public, that also helps, rebuild trust and faith in the media. But I think also the media has to look at itself and understand its weaknesses. And there are reasons why the public no longer trust the media as much as they used to. And you see in certain countries, I think in the United States, you can see it very clearly, a polarization in the media, especially on television, where the media becomes partisan, and that's not helpful to the public.
Yes, when it's getting active with matters in ways that it shouldn't, when it becomes, when it's no longer as objective as it could be.
Yeah, objective is a very difficult word. I was at a panel yesterday at the university where Sead Turkovic, the dean, said, if you don't take sides in a conflict, you're on the side of the oppressor, which is a quote from Desmond Tutu. So, but maintaining strict objectivity isn't always appropriate either, so it's a very fine balance for the media. And I remember when I was covering the story here, it was impossible not to empathize more with the Bosnians, just by, virtue of what we were seeing, and what we were experiencing when we were here. So it's very difficult as a journalist. I think the key is to try and be fair and to be accurate and to be reasonable, But that doesn't mean that you can't have an opinion, and that you shouldn't share that opinion, with the public.
As a journalist, you and your colleagues, especially some of them from the organization 7, have been part of the very significant process of documenting history. Yeah. And maybe before we touch upon the importance of documenting war crimes, what were those experiences like for you? I mean, you've been, if you could, for our viewers, maybe single out an experience or two of what you've witnessed, and if you ever, maybe I can ask you this as a colleague journalist, did you ever feel that all of it was in vain, or was it?
That's a great question. I think when I started my career, I thought I might be able to make individual photographs that would change the world, change the way people thought about things. But very quickly, I was disavowed of that idea. And I think perhaps here in Bosnia, I was disavowed of that idea. Because irrespective of the individual work I might produce, it didn't seem to change anything outside and the way that the world responded to Bosnia. But I think the totality of what the media did here did have an impact. So I felt that with my colleagues, if we focused enough attention and told the right stories, together we might move the needle a little bit. We could embarrass politicians at certain key moments overseas, who had influence at the UN or at the State Department, etc. But I must be honest, and when I covered this war here in Iraq, that's when I felt, that perhaps I was working in vain. And I started to feel by the time my career as a photojournalist, ended, that my contract with the people I was photographing couldn't be upheld by me, which was, I'm here to tell your story, to validate your life in some way, right? And to share that with people overseas, and that my work would be published honestly and fairly. And I felt that by the time I got to Iraq, it didn't matter what I photographed or with what intent, the work wouldn't be seen the way that I wanted it to be seen. So that's when I decided to change my career a little bit and shift direction.
I'm wondering now, you've spent decades, let's say, on the brink of, some kind of violence and hope at the same time. And you just recently, in one of the previous questions, when we spoke about objectivity of journalists, you mentioned fairness. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, have you come to conclusions what fairness or what justice is and what peace really means with everything that you have seen with your own eyes?
So I think the search for justice is perpetual, right? And justice takes a long time. It can take more than one lifetime. It can take generations to achieve. But it's something we need to seek to achieve. So the instruments of justice in any society need to be strong and they need to be prioritized. I think justice is emphatically important. But justice isn't served in the short term. As we can see with Palestine, it will take a very long time for justice to be served in that region, as it has done here. So we have to be patient with justice, but the search for it is critical. Peace, I think what I've learned from studying peace, especially in the context of Bosnia and the countries at war that I've worked in, is that peace isn't simply the cessation of war. Peace is something that you need to work on, again, for generations. And it takes more courage and more bravery to establish a healthy, peaceful society than it does to fight a war. And I think if, as societies, we can elevate peace and make it the highest human achievement, right? And not celebrate our warriors and our soldiers more, I think we will have reached a good space. But I am, a very hopeful person, and I think here in Bosnia, I think a lot of people here in Bosnia tend to often look at how far Bosnia has to go. And I look at how far has Bosnia come from this incredible violence that was perpetrated here for many years. I think it's done very well. And I think, here you have an enormously motivated, young generation, and there's much to be hopeful about here.
I think post-conflict societies often themselves forget that what they went through, and that they are not on the same trajectory, and that they did not have the same starting point in the, let's say, race, whatever it is, in economy, political status, or general well-being of a society or a country they live in. I don't know how much you're following the situation in Gaza, the attack on Gaza and the war and the genocide, but I'm wondering, how do you see, before I continue, the spirits of the Palestinians the resistance that we are witnessing on these cameras, where people are living through unimaginable atrocities?
Sure. I'm hyper aware of what my journalist colleagues are experiencing there, of course, because I see that, in front of me almost every day. And
many of our colleagues have been killed. Over
90, I think it was over 96. Of course, it increases every day. But over 90 journalists have been killed since October the 7th. It's hard for me to imagine, actually, how it is to wake up there every day. And for me, when I worked as a journalist, wherever I worked, I knew that I would always be able to leave, unless, I was unfortunate enough to be killed. But that was unlikely. So I knew I could always leave. For my Palestinian colleagues, our Palestinian colleagues, they can't leave very easily. It's incredibly difficult. They're stuck there. And also for me, I have never had the misfortune of photographing my own people suffering during a war. I've only photographed others. And so I can't imagine what it is for a Palestinian journalist to wake up every morning, kiss their family goodbye and go out and work. I have nothing but admiration, and I salute them. It's an extraordinary thing that they are doing. Extraordinary, and they're doing it incredibly well. Whatever generation we are, you also mentioned,
world wars in Europe, there was this never again Nazi Germany and Holocaust, never again apartheid in South Africa, never again the genocide in Rwanda and in Bosnia. And however, 30 years have passed, and we are where we are with what's happening, for example, in Gaza. And I don't know how you see this, the responsibility you said we all have and the world has. How are we here? How are we not just, there is no, we can see what's happening. There are ways, there are channels, there are people who are losing their lives to show the world what's happening in Gaza. And it's not just that somebody is ignoring it, but some countries are supporting it diplomatically, politically, financially. Yes. How are we living through this? And is there going, do you think, from your experience, will there be accountability?
I think ultimately there can be accountability, but it takes a lot of will for there to be accountability, and accountability takes time. Justice takes time, but justice does have a long reach. And as we saw in Rwanda, as we saw in Nazi Germany, as we saw to some extent in Cambodia, and certainly here, justice might feel inadequate sometimes, and it might take a long time to come, but it does come if there is political will. I think the complexity in the case of what's happening in Gaza is whether there will be political will. And I have no idea, but justice is something that takes time. But what troubles me, I have confidence in justice, generally speaking. I think there are mechanisms that can work. But what troubles me is, you know, I have photographed the tail end. I started my career photographing in Cambodia at the end of the civil war there. I photographed here. I photographed in Rwanda. Genocide, mass murder of civilians never seems to end. And, you know, putting justice in place is one thing, but it's preventing this from happening in the first place. That's the problem that we really need to solve, you know, because one of the purposes of justice is to act as a deterrent. And if it doesn't act as a deterrent, then you have to ask, what's the point, right? It's just an accounting in the end. And that, for me, is the most troubling thing about what we're witnessing now. And that's where journalists fits in, you know, for all of this work that we do, documenting genocide here, documenting genocide in Rwanda, documenting violence all over the world. One has to feel at some point that it's going to have an effect, not in an accounting, but in prevention, right? And that, for me, is a source of frustration as a journalist.
What more could be done? Let's try to end on a constructive note regarding prevention, because we have all of these lessons that we are very happy to talk about once they are done. And then there's a test of civilization right now. Yeah. And a significant part of the world is failing at preventing it.
If I had the answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting in this chair today. But I think, you know, the problem we have to solve is created by politics, right? And I think the solution is to have a more literate, right, and more civic-minded population. And that starts in schools. And that starts through education. And it starts with a process of, you know, enabling our children to overcome the hatred of their parents, right? And the prejudice of their parents. You know, my parents are still uncomfortable with Japan and Germany because they lived through World War II. That's 70 years ago, you know, 80 years ago. So I don't struggle with that, but that's a long period, right? So I think, you know, we need to work on training, education, literacy, working on the young generation to overcome the prejudice of their parents, to prevent these things from happening, and be more resistant to the kind of populist politics that we are now seeing re-emerging, 100 years after the last devastating emergence of populist politicians around the world, right, that took the world into the Second World War. But I do not have the solution to those problems, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, if we take the education part, that segment, I feel that you are working on it through your academy, through the foundation, and hopefully educating some new generations and offering context.
I think it's a little bit like the journalism, I recognized early on that my journalism alone wasn't going to change anything, right? But with all of my colleagues, we might be able to change something. And I think if all of us are engaged in, mentoring and training and challenging the younger generation to imagine a better world and helping them, giving them the tools to make it, then we might get somewhere. But I'm very hopeful in this younger generation. I don't think they're snowflakes. I think I have very great confidence that I'm aging into a world where there's a very, very, very smart, engaged, thoughtful younger generation that will inherit it.
I heard the saying, the kids are all right.
The kids are all right.
Mr. Knight, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
We ask the question, what is needed in the world? Is that going to be